Nask here. On Tuesday, September 20th, 2016, an African-American man by the name of Keith Lamont Scott was shot and killed during a stop by the CMPD in Charlotte, North Carolina, where it is claimed by Scott's family that at the time he was sitting in his car reading a book while waiting for his son to come home from school. Police Chief Kerr Putney, on the other hand, maintains the position of the authorities that Scott was armed with no book being found at the scene, and that Scott had exited the vehicle with a gun, defying commands by the officer to drop the weapon before he was shot. It didn't take long for the story of the shooting to begin circulating heavily across social media, quickly igniting an uproar from the city's black community. Well before an official investigation could be launched and begin piecing together the situation and releasing the facts of the case to the public, protesters were already out in the streets. Of course, very quickly, Black Lives Matter was on the ground, seeming to instigate the protests into an anti-police fervor. Black Lives Matter supporters and activists continue even now to push their narrative as the city asks for calm and peaceful demonstrations while an investigation can work through the situation. This seemed to have no real effect on many of the rioters over the following couple of days since the shooting, as rioters moved through parts of the city, vandalizing property, looting, destroying police and civilian vehicles, and injuring over a dozen officers as they pelted the authorities with bottles and rocks. The rioters even went so far as to vandalize and loot a nearby Walmart after having shut down Interstate 85, damaging civilian and police vehicles from overpasses and on the road itself, as well as looting several tractor-trailers of their contents, starting 2 fires in the process, until police finally forced them from the freeway. While the riots, being stoked and instigated by the Black Lives Matter supporters and their narrative of racially motivated police killings being the main factor in a series of deaths in recent months, continued on, resulting in further violence and vandalism toward the city, civilians, and the police, the narrative being pushed by the activists is being refuted by the city and the police department, who say that the officer involved in the shooting was one Brentley Vinson, a black officer, and that this was not an incident of racism and intentional targeting of black individuals, but was an incident of an armed civilian not complying with the authorities to drop his weapon and therefore being seen as a threat. Chief Putney then held a press conference regarding the situation and as an address to the protesters. "It's time for the voiceless majority to stand up and be heard," said the police chief, who is black. "It's time to change the narrative because I can tell you from the facts that the story is a little bit different as to how it's been portrayed so far, especially through social media." He went on to further clarify some information on the situation. Putney said evidence and witnesses support the officer's claim that Scott was armed. Officers repeatedly told Scott to drop his handgun, the chief said, but he didn't. Officer Brentley Vinson, who was black, then shot him. The chief said he was not certain whether Scott pointed his gun at officers. Vinson, who was in plain clothes and wearing a CMPD vest, did not have a body camera. 3 uniformed officers were wearing cameras. There is also dash cam recordings, and investigators are reviewing the footage, Putney said. And so the false narrative being pushed by protesters and Black Lives Matter activists seems distinctly in conflict with the official reports so far. And I use the term false narrative, as in all this time, through all of these protests and riots, very little to no real evidence of proclaimed white supremacy and privilege that the group has spoken of has been found or their claims substantiated. Instead, we hear the same claims, accusations, and buzzwords used over and over again without any of these activists providing concrete evidence to support them. The group continues to push the claim as well that the officer in particular who shot Scott was white, contrary to the department's own statements and naming of the officer, and that this is another example of a problem of systemic racism within the police force. Black Lives Matter continues to publicly state that their movement is a show of civil disobedience, peaceful protests, and is not pushing an anti-white agenda. In the wake of the shooting in Charlotte, North Carolina, however, condemnation from the group on the looting, vandalism, and violence seems too few and far between, while even journalists and civilians, as well as police officers, don't seem safe from the violence from a protest seemingly without direction. As the protests continue, it becomes apparent of how little there is in the way of protesting, of demanding answers or making a message heard, as destroying property, looting, and creating havoc, aggressive self-interest seeming to be the only goal in mind. While activists will get on television, pushing their narrative and demanding a boycott of white businesses, rioters are out in the streets, assaulting journalists, assaulting the homeless for no apparent reason other than their skin color, attacking police and civilians alike, destroying businesses and property, even going so far as to attempt to set a photographer on fire by shoving or dragging them into the flames. While I am sure that there are plenty of people taking advantage of the situation for their own personal gain, satisfaction, and glorification, I personally can't help but feel situations like this, the violence, the vandalism, the looting, the aggression, is sadly reflective of cultural issues in the black community in this country. a community and culture that seems to promote violence, crime, and a victimhood mentality, all serving to only fuel racial tensions. Many black communities have long been plagued with issues of drugs, gangs, poverty, crime, poor education, and a distrust of authorities. And so it would seem possible then that communities struggling with these plethora of issues would have difficulty in addressing them, most people finding it easier instead to adapt to it than to find long-term resolutions, essentially taking the path of least resistance in their efforts. The Black Lives Matter movement, however, seems to be lighting a fire under the black community as a whole, using false and exaggerated narratives to make all blacks out to be victims of oppression by an unseen system of white supremacy and privilege, an epidemic of systemic racism in police departments across the nation, defending every black individual as innocent and pure regardless of any evidence to the contrary, boldly claiming that every instance is another example of a black individual being killed or gunned down due to no other reason than the color of their skin, and in doing so, incite a significant level of anti-white and anti-police sentiment, only serving to increase already strained racial tensions in this country. Regardless of the Black Lives Matter narratives, it is these rioters who most reflect on their movement. Demanding greater transparency and police accountability is reasonable and understandably necessary, but as the request of city officials and authorities for calm and peaceful protesting goes unheeded, as the evidence they present goes entirely dismissed in favor of a baseless narrative to blame whites and cops to justify violence, when there is no time to even allow for a proper investigation to occur before violence and demonstrations are incited against the city and innocent bystanders, then the Black Lives Matter movement has no one to blame aside from themselves for their message being drowned out in the chaos. While some attempt to protest peacefully and open discussions surrounding the situation, it is the rioters who put their attempts on the back burner. The violent anti-white rhetoric from parts of the movement may or may not be the majority, but they are the loudest and most fervent. As I explained in a response video to Trey Melvin, not all members and supporters of the movement do or have to think the way these people think, but that does not mean that such sentiments aren't a detriment. It's this very vocal and very outspoken minority of voices in the movement that taint it, not because these voices in and of themselves have a great effect on the movement, but because overwhelmingly the rest of the Black Lives Matter movement either refuses to acknowledge and condemn these voices, or it simply outright is silent on them. The movement as a whole would rather be more content to shrug these voices off than to combat them, only ensuring that the movement itself is complicit in allowing an infection to make it sick like a cancer and turn it into something else entirely. Racial tensions in this country are higher than ever, and they will only get worse so long as these groups on the regressive left, such as Black Lives Matter and other social justice organizations, continue to infect the conversation with divisive and racialized arguments and rhetoric, while actively dismissing any kind of discussion or counter-arguments unless they're done on their own terms, thereby only serving to stifle any reasonable chance at realistically resolving the issues we're having this day and age. The issues of race and police overreach in this country will never be solved with violence. Violence will only ever serve to detract from the conversation and taint the message and reputation of any group who promotes, enables, or condones it. In the long term, continued violence will only ever be seen as unnecessary, unreasonable, and stigmatizing. If Black Lives Matter wants to make real and effective change, then being complicit when the violence begins or even outright condoning it, as well as pushing exaggerated false narratives in order to instigate racial divisions, will never serve them or their message well in the court of public opinion.